October 27, 1944, a Thursday afternoon in rural Georgia. Irmgard Zimmerman had been taught that Americans were ruthless, that they showed no mercy to their enemies, that capture meant brutality, starvation, perhaps even death. So when the guard approached her with a small wrapped package and a glass bottle filled with dark liquid, she instinctively pulled back, her body tensing against the rough wooden bench. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the compound where 58 German women sat in anxious silence. They had arrived only hours earlier, transported from the port in Virginia to this facility surrounded by pine trees and red clay earth. Everything felt foreign and threatening. The air itself tasted different here, thick and warm despite the season. The guard, a young man with kind eyes and sun-weathered skin, smiled and extended the items again. "Moon pie," he said slowly, pointing to the wrapped disc. "Ars cola. For you." His accent was thick, vowels stretched in ways that made the English words sound almost musical. Irma looked down at the offering. The package was covered in colorful paper with a crescent moon and words she could barely decipher. The bottle bore a red and blue label, condensation beading on the glass. Her stomach clenched with hunger she had tried to ignore for weeks, but suspicion held her hand steady. Around her, other guards were distributing the same items to her fellow prisoners. Elfriede Becker, sitting 3 places down, accepted hers with trembling fingers. Brunhilde Neumann refused to even look at the guard standing before her, her jaw set in rigid defiance. Young Gertrude Richter, barely 19 years old, stared at the wrapped treat with undisguised longing. "It's good," the guard said, demonstrating by pretending to bite something and rubbing his stomach. "Sweet. You eat." He carefully unwrapped one of the packages, revealing what looked like 2 round cookies with something white between them, all covered in chocolate. He took a bite and smiled. Irma watched him chew and swallow. If it was poisoned, he was a talented actor, and if they wanted the prisoners dead, surely there were more efficient methods than elaborate deceptions involving confections. Her fingers finally reached out and accepted the package and bottle. The wrapper crinkled as she opened it. The chocolate coating felt slightly soft in the warm air. She brought it to her nose and inhaled cautiously. Sweet. Definitely sweet. Almost overwhelmingly so after months of bland rations and weeks of near starvation during transport. She took the smallest bite possible. Chocolate melted on her tongue, followed by something impossibly fluffy and sweet, then the graham texture of the cookie. Her eyes widened involuntarily. She looked at Elfie, who had also risked a taste. Their gazes met across the space between them, and for the first time since capture, something other than fear flickered in their expressions. 3 weeks earlier, northern France had still been a battlefield. Irmgard remembered the chaos of retreat, the constant sound of artillery, the desperate attempts to maintain radio communications as Allied forces advanced. She had been stationed in a communications bunker outside Lille, part of the Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing she was serving her country's defense. The capture itself had been almost anticlimactic. American soldiers surrounded the bunker at dawn. An officer shouted in broken German for them to surrender. 16 women emerged with their hands raised, exhausted and terrified. Irma had expected immediate execution. Instead, the Americans searched them professionally, confiscated their equipment, and loaded them onto trucks. The journey across France to the port felt surreal. They were kept separate from male prisoners, housed in a converted school building under guard. The Americans provided adequate food, basic medical care, and treated them with distant professionalism. No beatings, no interrogations with torture, just endless waiting and uncertainty about their fate. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days aboard a Liberty ship. The women were confined to a cargo hold converted into makeshift quarters. Seasickness plagued them constantly. The smell of vomit and unwashed bodies became overwhelming. They had been issued thin blankets and fed twice daily with bland but sufficient rations. Still, Irma had expected worse. The propaganda had promised horrors that never materialized. More women joined their group during the voyage. Elfriede Becker had been captured near the Belgian border, serving as a medical assistant at a field hospital. Brunhilde Neumann had worked in administrative capacities in Paris until the liberation. Gertrude Richter had been part of a kitchen auxiliary unit. Anneliese Vogel, quiet and traumatized, had been a radio operator like Irma. They spoke little during the crossing. What was there to say? Their country was losing the war. Their families faced unknown fates as Allied bombs fell on German cities. They were prisoners being transported to enemy territory, powerless and afraid. Upon reaching Virginia, they were processed through a military facility. American women in uniform photographed them, recorded their information, and issued them simple gray dresses to replace their auxiliary uniforms. The removal of those uniforms felt like shedding their identities. Without the insignia and military structure, they became simply displaced women, cut off from everything they had known. The train journey south to Georgia took 2 days. They watched through barred windows as the American landscape rolled past. The abundance shocked them. Towns that showed no signs of bombing, farms with full fields, people going about ordinary lives, untouched by the destruction consuming Europe, children playing, stores with goods displayed in windows. Germany had been on strict rationing for years. Every resource had been channeled toward the war effort. Seeing this American prosperity felt almost obscene. How could they possibly win against a nation with such overwhelming wealth? When they finally arrived at the Georgia facility, stepping off the train into humid October air, Irma carried only a small cloth bag containing her few remaining possessions: a comb, a photograph of her family, a stub of pencil, and small notebook. Everything else had been lost or confiscated. She expected prison. Instead, she found pine trees, neat barracks, and guards who handed out chocolate-covered treats. The days following that first moon pie distribution fell into unexpected routine. The women were assigned to clean barracks with proper beds and thin mattresses. Far better than the ship's hold. Far better than many places they had slept during the war's final, chaotic months. They received 3 meals daily in a common dining hall. Plain American food: potatoes, beans, bread, sometimes meat, always sufficient quantities. The guards maintained professional distance, but without hostility. They were mostly young men, many barely older than the German women themselves. Some appeared to be farm boys from rural backgrounds. Others had the careful demeanor of men who had seen combat and wanted no more violence. Sergeant William Patterson was different from the start. He approached the language barrier as a problem to solve rather than a wall to maintain. He was 24 years old, tall and lean with sun-browned skin and an easy smile. His family grew peaches and cotton in southern Georgia. He had been assigned to guard duty after being wounded in North Africa, his left leg still carrying shrapnel that made him limp slightly. He began with simple words, pointing to objects and saying their English names slowly: table, chair, door, window. He encouraged the women to repeat after him, patient when their German accents mangled the unfamiliar sounds. Most prisoners ignored him initially, suspicious of any friendliness. But Irma, who had studied some English in school years ago, found herself responding. Her tongue struggled with the strange sounds. English felt slippery compared to German's precise consonants. But memories returned gradually. Vocabulary she had learned as a teenager, basic grammar structures. She began to construct simple sentences. "Thank you," she managed one afternoon when Sergeant Patterson brought extra blankets as October temperatures dropped. The words felt foreign in her mouth, but his face lit up with genuine pleasure at her attempt. "You're welcome," he replied, speaking slowly so she could follow. "You speak English good, better than my German." He attempted a phrase in her language, his pronunciation so terrible that despite herself, Irma almost smiled. The interaction broke something inside her, not trust, not yet. But the rigid certainty that all Americans were enemies began to crack slightly. This young man with his patient teaching and terrible German accent did not fit the propaganda's description of ruthless invaders. Other guards noticed Patterson's informal lessons, and some joined in. They brought newspapers and pointed to pictures, teaching vocabulary. They demonstrated actions and spoke the corresponding verbs. The women who participated began to acquire basic communication skills. Elfie learned medical terminology from Dr. Green, who appreciated having someone who could understand anatomical terms even if they needed translation. Trudy picked up kitchen vocabulary quickly, her young mind absorbing new words like a sponge. Even Hilda, initially the most resistant, eventually began listening to the lessons, though she refused to actively participate. Language became the first genuine bridge between captors and prisoners. With each new word, the women became slightly less foreign to their guards. With each successful communication, both sides recognized shared humanity beneath the uniforms and circumstances. Irma filled her small notebook with English words, practicing pronunciation under her breath during evening hours. Learning the language of her captors felt like a small act of control in a situation where she controlled nothing else. Dr. Samuel Green had served in the Army Medical Corps since 1942. He had seen combat injuries in Italy, treated soldiers in field hospitals, and witnessed suffering that still haunted his sleep. At 38 years old, he considered his assignment to a prisoner of war camp a respite from the horrors of frontline medicine. He expected routine sick calls and minor ailments. He did not expect Elfrida Becker. Elfie had been watching the camp medical clinic since her arrival. She noticed how Dr. Green conducted sick call each morning, how he organized his supplies, how he treated the few prisoners who required medical attention. She recognized competence in his methods. More importantly, she recognized compassion in how he spoke to patients, even when language barriers made communication difficult. When a flu outbreak struck the compound in early November, Elfie made her decision. She approached Dr. Green during morning sick call, gestured to the overwhelmed medic trying to manage multiple patients, and in halting English, supplemented with gestures, offered to help. Dr. Green's first instinct was refusal. She was a prisoner. Regulations existed for reasons, but he was practical enough to recognize desperation when he saw it. 6 women were running fevers. His single medic was exhausted. This German woman clearly had medical training based on how she had been observing his clinic procedures. "You are nurse?" he asked slowly in English. "Ah, yes, Krankenschwester, nurse helper," Elfie replied, mixing German and English. She pointed to patients and mimicked taking temperature, checking pulse, administering medicine. Dr. Green made a command decision. "Okay, you help, but I watch everything." Elfie proved her competence within hours. She took vital signs correctly. She recognized symptoms of dehydration and pneumonia risk. She kept patients comfortable with cool cloths and positioning. Most importantly, she seemed to genuinely care about their suffering, treating her fellow German prisoners with gentle efficiency. Her knowledge of anatomy was solid. She could identify symptoms and communicate them to Dr. Green through combination of English, German, and medical terminology that transcended language. When he needed to demonstrate a procedure, she learned quickly and executed it correctly. "Where did you train?" Dr. Green asked one afternoon as they cleaned the clinic after treating patients. Elfie's English had improved through constant exposure. Munich, hospital, 3 years training, then war, field hospital near Belgium, I assist surgeons. Her face clouded. "Many wounded, many die, very bad." Dr. Green understood that expression. He had worn it himself after particularly brutal days in Italian field hospitals. Trauma was trauma, regardless of which uniform you wore while witnessing it. Over the following weeks, Elfie became indispensable to the clinic's operation. She worked with quiet dedication, never complaining about long hours or difficult tasks. She sterilized instruments, organized supplies, prepared medications, and assisted with everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses. The other prisoners noticed. Having one of their own in the medical clinic created a sense of security. Elfie could explain treatments in German, could reassure frightened women, could serve as cultural bridge between American medicine and German patients. Dr. Green found himself respecting her clinical judgment. He began asking her opinion on cases, curious about her observations. What began as a spontaneous gesture of kindness evolved into something more meaningful than anyone anticipated. The moon pies and RC Cola distribution became a weekly event occurring every Wednesday afternoon at precisely 1400 hours. The women came to anticipate it with an eagerness that surprised even themselves. Sergeant Patterson explained through Irma's improving translation that a local bakery distributor had surplus moon pies that would otherwise go to waste. The camp commander approved their distribution to prisoners as a morale gesture. The RC Cola came from similar surplus. It cost the military nothing and provided a small comfort to displaced women far from home. But for the prisoners, these Wednesday distributions represented something far more profound than simple treats. They became markers of time in a place where days blurred together. They became moments of unexpected pleasure in circumstances defined by uncertainty. Most importantly, they became evidence that their captors saw them as human beings worthy of small kindnesses. Gertrude Richter lived for Wednesdays. At 19, she was the youngest prisoner in the compound. She had joined the Auxiliary Corps straight from her family's bakery in Stuttgart, believing she would be baking for German soldiers. Instead, she had found herself assigned to a field kitchen near the French border. Capture had terrified her. She expected brutality from the Americans. Instead, she found chocolate marshmallow treats that reminded her of childhood sweets her father had occasionally managed to create despite wartime rationing. She savored each moon pie slowly, making it last as long as possible. The chocolate coating melted on her tongue. The marshmallow filling provided impossible sweetness. The graham cookies offered satisfying texture. She had learned to pair bites with sips of the RC Cola, the carbonation and sweetness, creating a combination that felt almost decadent. Other women developed their own relationships with the Wednesday ritual. Brunhilde Neumann, who maintained rigid distance from her captors in most circumstances, accepted her moon pie and cola with something approaching gratitude. She never thanked the guards verbally, but her posture softened slightly during distributions. Annalisa Vogel, traumatized and withdrawn since her capture, showed the first signs of emotional thaw during these Wednesday moments. She would hold her moon pie carefully, examining it with something like wonder before eating. The routine and predictability seemed to comfort her shattered nerves. Irma noticed how the guards' behavior during distributions revealed their characters. Sergeant Patterson always distributed treats with genuine warmth, remembering which women preferred to eat immediately versus saving theirs for later. Other guards performed the duty mechanically but fairly. A few showed subtle contempt, tossing packages rather than handing them properly. The ritual became a measurement of changing relationships within the compound. As autumn progressed toward winter, the Wednesday distributions grew warmer in tone. Guards began learning prisoners' names. Small conversations developed despite language barriers. The women's initial suspicion gradually transformed into something resembling trust. One Wednesday in late November, Trudy approached Sergeant Patterson with a question Irma translated. "Why do you give us these treats? We are your enemies." Patterson considered his response carefully. "The war made us enemies," he said slowly. "But you're still people, and people deserve small kindnesses when possible." That answer, translated into German, circulated through the compound for days afterward. It challenged everything the women had been taught about Americans. It suggested that perhaps enemy was a temporary condition rather than a permanent identity. The International Red Cross had established procedures for prisoners of war to contact their families. Each woman in the compound was permitted to send a standardized letter, informing loved ones of their capture and general well-being. The forms were simple, allowing only basic information. No details about location or camp conditions, just confirmation of survival and prisoner status. Irmgard filled out her form in early November, addressing it to her parents in Dresden. She had no way of knowing if they still lived at the address she remembered. Allied bombing raids had destroyed significant portions of the city, but she wrote the address carefully, hoping the Red Cross could somehow locate them if they had survived and relocated. She kept her message simple. I am alive and healthy. I am a prisoner in America. I think of you always. Please write if you receive this. Your daughter, Irmgard. 43 words that carried the weight of months of separation and uncertainty. Every woman in the compound submitted similar letters. They handed them to the camp administrator with expressions mixing hope and dread. Then came the waiting. The Red Cross warned that responses could take months. Mail routes between America and war-torn Europe were unreliable. Many addresses would prove unreachable. Families might be displaced, killed, or unable to respond for countless reasons. December passed with no responses. January brought a few letters for 3 prisoners whose families had somehow received the Red Cross notifications and managed to send replies. The joy of those women receiving mail created sharp contrast with the continued silence experienced by everyone else. Irma watched the mail distribution each week with diminishing hope. No letter from Dresden, no word about whether her parents, her younger brother, her grandmother had survived. The silence felt worse than confirmation of death. At least death provided certainty. This endless not knowing created a special kind of torture. Elfrida received word in late January that changed everything. A Red Cross letter confirmed that Hamburg, her home city, had been effectively destroyed by firebombing raids in July of 1943. The specific address she had listed no longer existed. Her family could not be located. They were either dead or displaced beyond the Red Cross's ability to trace. Elfie read the letter in the medical clinic where she was organizing supplies. Dr. Green watched her face crumble as she processed the words. She made no sound, just stood perfectly still, the letter trembling in her hands, tears streaming silently down her face. "Bad news?" Dr. Green asked gently. Elfie nodded, unable to speak. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. Then she returned to organizing bandages with shaking hands, seeking comfort in routine tasks while her world collapsed internally. Annalisa Vogel's response arrived in February. Unlike Elfie's devastating uncertainty, Lisa received horrible certainty. Her mother and 2 younger sisters had been killed in an air raid on Hamburg. Her father was missing, presumed dead. Her brother had died fighting on the Eastern Front. She was, as far as anyone knew, the sole survivor of her immediate family. Lisa's breakdown was immediate and complete. She screamed until her voice went hoarse. She collapsed in the barracks, sobbing with grief so profound that other prisoners could only hold her and weep alongside her. December brought colder weather to Georgia, though nothing compared to German winters. The pine trees remained green while the deciduous oaks dropped their leaves. The red clay earth hardened with occasional frost. Inside the compound, the women faced their first Christmas in captivity, with mixed emotions of grief, homesickness, and unexpected curiosity about how Americans celebrated the holiday. The camp commander, Colonel Richard Hayes, was a Methodist minister's son from Atlanta. He believed in the Geneva Convention's provisions for humane treatment of prisoners, but also in the Christian principle of showing mercy even to enemies. He authorized modest Christmas preparations for the compound, allocating a small budget for decorations and special holiday meals. The announcement came through Irma's translation during morning roll call in early December. The women would be permitted to create decorations from available materials. They would receive a special Christmas dinner. Religious services would be arranged for those who wished to attend. The news created an immediate stir of conversation among the prisoners. Some women resisted the idea entirely. Brunhilde argued that celebrating Christmas in enemy captivity felt like betrayal of their homeland. How could they participate in American holiday observances while Germany suffered? Others, particularly the younger women, like Trudy, saw the opportunity differently. Christmas had always meant brief respite from hardship, moments of beauty and hope, even in difficult times. Irma found herself mediating between perspectives. She understood Hilda's position, but also recognized that refusing every gesture of normalcy would make their captivity even more unbearable. They could honor their German identity while still accepting whatever small comforts their situation allowed. The women began creating decorations with surprising creativity. They folded paper into stars and snowflakes using techniques remembered from childhood. They fashioned garlands from pine branches gathered near the compound perimeter. Someone discovered how to create ornaments from tin cans, carefully cutting and shaping the metal into decorative forms. Elfie, still grieving her lost family, threw herself into the preparation work with almost desperate energy. She needed tasks to occupy her hands and mind. She taught other women how to create traditional German paper chains, the repetitive work providing comfort through familiar patterns. The guards contributed materials when they could. Sergeant Patterson brought colored paper from town. Another guard donated string for hanging decorations. Dr. Green provided some medical gauze that enterprising women transformed into angel wing decorations. The collaboration between prisoners and guards deepened through this shared project. As Christmas approached, an idea developed among the women. They would create a program for Christmas Eve, something to offer their captors as gesture of appreciation for unexpected kindnesses. Not capitulation, but acknowledgement that mercy had been shown when cruelty could have been chosen instead. Irma approached Colonel Hayes through official channels with their proposal. The women wished to sing Christmas carols, both German and American, as their gift to the camp staff. They had been practicing English versions of traditional songs, their pronunciation imperfect, but their intentions sincere. The colonel approved immediately. He arranged for the main dining hall to be prepared for an evening gathering. Word spread through the compound and among the guards that something unprecedented was being planned. Christmas Eve 1944 would mark a moment when enemies would gather together in celebration rather than conflict. The women spent remaining days before Christmas practicing their songs, their voices harmonizing in ways that transcended the circumstances of their imprisonment. For brief moments during rehearsals, they forgot they were prisoners. They were simply women singing together, creating beauty in a world that had shown them primarily ugliness. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. The main dining hall had been transformed through modest but meaningful efforts. Pine branches adorned the walls. Paper decorations hung from rafters. Someone had fashioned a small tree from branches, decorated with the handmade ornaments. 2 candles provided gentle light alongside electric bulbs. The room smelled of pine and the yeast rolls being prepared for dinner. The 58 German women gathered early, nervous about their planned performance. They wore their simple gray prison dresses, but had tried to make themselves presentable. Hair had been carefully arranged. Faces had been washed clean. They stood in rough formation near the front of the hall, waiting for the American guards and staff to arrive. Sergeant Patterson entered first, followed by other guards, Dr. Green, administrative staff, and finally, Colonel Hayes. They filled the benches, arranged as audience seating, perhaps 40 Americans total, curious about what the German prisoners had planned. Irma stepped forward as spokesperson. Her English had improved dramatically over 2 months of practice. Colonel Hayes, guards, and all staff, she began formally. We thank you for permission to celebrate Christmas. We wish to give you our gift. It is only songs, but we sing from our hearts. The women began with O Tannenbaum, their voices blending in the familiar German carol. The harmonies were precise, trained through German musical education that emphasized choral singing. The melody filled the hall with unexpected beauty. Some guards who had fought in Europe recognized the tune, their faces showing complex emotions at hearing enemy voices creating such loveliness. They followed with Stille Nacht, the German original of Silent Night. Their voices softened to match the carol's gentle reverence. Anneliese, despite her recent devastating losses, sang with the others. Music seemed to reach parts of her grief-shattered soul that words could not touch. Then came the moment that would be remembered by everyone present. The women transitioned to English, attempting Silent Night in their captor's language. Their German accents mangled some pronunciations. Sleep in Heavenly Peace came out with heavy consonants and uncertain vowels, but the effort was unmistakable. They were singing in the enemy's language, building a bridge through music. Several guards looked visibly moved. Sergeant Patterson had tears in his eyes. He later wrote to his family describing this moment, trying to explain how hearing these German women sing Christmas carols had reminded him that war created artificial divisions between people who shared fundamental humanity. The women concluded with "We wish you a Merry Christmas," their English more confident on this simpler melody. When they finished, silence filled the hall for several heartbeats before applause erupted from the American audience. Colonel Hayes stood. "Ladies, that was beautiful. Thank you for sharing your traditions with us." Through Irma's translation, his words reached the German women, many of whom had been terrified their performance would be rejected or mocked. What happened next surprised everyone. Sergeant Patterson suggested the Americans should sing in return. Impromptu and unrehearsed, the guards and staff began "Joy to the World." Their voices were less polished than the German women's trained harmonies, but their sincerity matched the prisoners' offering. After that, the Christmas Eve gathering transformed into something unprecedented. Americans and Germans sang together, teaching each other carols in both languages. Laughter emerged when pronunciation attempts went comically wrong. January 1945 brought routine to the compound. The holiday warmth had created lasting changes in how guards and prisoners interacted. Conversations occurred more freely. English lessons continued, with multiple guards now participating. The women worked various jobs around the facility. The war continued in Europe and the Pacific. But inside the Georgia compound, an unexpected peace had developed. Then April arrived with news that would shatter everything the German women believed about their country and themselves. Allied forces were advancing deep into Germany from both east and west. As they liberated territory, they discovered camps, not prisoner of war camps for military combatants, but something else entirely. Places with names that meant nothing to most people, but would soon become synonymous with humanity's darkest capabilities. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The camp library received American newspapers regularly. Normally, few prisoners read them due to language barriers and lack of interest in American news. But in mid-April, images began appearing on front pages that transcended language. Photographs that showed horrors so extreme that initial reaction was disbelief. Irma saw the first newspaper on April 15th. The front page of the Atlanta Constitution showed photographs from Bergen-Belsen's liberation, emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors who looked more like living skeletons than human beings, British soldiers wearing expressions of shock and horror. The headline read, "Nazi Death Camp Horrors Revealed." She stared at the images, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. This could not be real. This had to be propaganda, fabrications designed to justify the war against Germany. No civilized nation could do such things. Not the Germany she knew, the Germany of music and philosophy and scientific achievement. But more newspapers arrived daily with more photographs and more detailed reports. American journalists described what they witnessed as Allied forces liberated camp after camp, the systematic starvation, the mass executions, the medical experiments, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the millions of dead. Elfrida found Irma in the library, surrounded by newspapers, tears streaming down her face. "Irma, tell me these are lies," Elfie whispered in German. "Tell me Americans are inventing these stories." Irma could not offer that comfort. The photographs were too numerous, too detailed, too consistent across multiple sources. The testimonies from survivors, from Allied soldiers, from the few captured camp personnel, matched too closely. This was not propaganda. This was documentation of truth too terrible to fully comprehend. Other women gathered around the newspapers. Some read the English articles laboriously with dictionaries. Others simply stared at the photographs, which needed no translation. The images spoke a universal language of suffering and evil. Annalise began screaming. She had lost her entire family to the war, had been barely holding herself together through grief and trauma. Now she was confronting evidence that her country, her people, had committed atrocities that made individual wartime deaths seem almost merciful by comparison. Brunhilde stood rigid, her face pale. She had been the most resistant to American influence, the most insistent on maintaining German pride and identity. Now she was staring at photographs that demolished any possibility of defending the Reich. "Wir wussten nichts davon," she whispered. "We knew nothing about this." The days following the concentration camp revelations transformed the compound's atmosphere. The German women moved through their routines mechanically, their faces haunted. Conversations occurred in whispers. Many stopped eating properly, their appetites destroyed by images they could not unsee. Some cried constantly, others became frighteningly silent. Irma filled pages of her small notebook with tortured questions. How had she not known? Had there been signs she ignored? She remembered vague references to camps, to relocations, to solutions for problems never clearly defined. She had believed what she was told, that these were work camps, detention facilities for criminals and enemies of the state. The propaganda had been effective because people wanted to believe it. But wanting to believe lies did not absolve her of responsibility. She had served the Reich. She had operated communications equipment that facilitated military operations. She had been part of the machinery, even if she had not understood the full horror of what that machinery was designed to accomplish. The American Guard's reactions varied significantly. Some became noticeably colder toward the prisoners, their previous kindness replaced with barely concealed contempt. If these women had served the regime that created such camps, did they not share in the guilt? Several guards requested transfers, unwilling to treat German prisoners with any compassion after seeing the documented atrocities. But others, surprisingly, became even more compassionate. Sergeant Patterson was among them. He had seen the same newspapers and photographs. He had felt the same shock and revulsion. But he had also come to know these particular German women over months of daily interaction. He had watched them learn English, work diligently, show genuine kindness to each other, and demonstrate human decency in countless small ways. One afternoon he found Irma sitting alone behind the barracks, her face buried in her hands. He approached cautiously and sat nearby without speaking. After long silence, Irma finally looked up. Her eyes were red from crying. "We did not know," she said in English. "But should we have known? Is not knowing enough excuse?" Patterson considered his response carefully. "Ignorance does not make you innocent," he said slowly, "but it also does not make you personally guilty of crimes you did not commit and did not know about. You have to decide what you do now with the knowledge you have." Those words struck Irma deeply. What could she do? She was a prisoner in a foreign country. Her homeland was destroyed. Her family's fate remained unknown. She had no power, no influence, no ability to change anything about the horrors that had been revealed. Dr. Green had similar conversations with Elfrida. Her work in the medical clinic had shown him her fundamental decency and compassion. He struggled to reconcile the caring nurse who treated patients with such gentleness with the reality of German doctors who had conducted monstrous experiments on concentration camp victims. "You are not those doctors," he told her firmly. "You chose to heal. That choice matters." But Elfie was not convinced. "I wore the uniform," she replied in halting English. "I served the system. How can I separate myself from it?" The Wednesday moon pie distribution became painful. Some women refused to accept the treats, feeling they did not deserve even small pleasures while millions had suffered unspeakable horrors. Others accepted mechanically, eating without tasting, the ritual now tainted by knowledge of what their countrymen had done. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with celebrations across America. Church bells rang in nearby towns. People danced in streets. Newspapers printed victory headlines in the largest type available. The war in Europe had ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. Inside the compound, the German women faced this news with complex emotions impossible to articulate. Relief that the killing had stopped. Grief for their destroyed homeland. Shame about the reasons for defeat. Uncertainty about what came next. They gathered in small groups, speaking quietly in German, trying to process what this moment meant. Germany no longer existed as they had known it. The country was occupied by Allied forces, divided into zones of control. Cities lay in ruins. The government had collapsed completely. Millions were dead or displaced. Everything familiar had been destroyed, and they had no idea what would rise from the ashes. Official announcements came within days. Repatriation procedures would begin for prisoners of war across America. Male prisoners in camps throughout the country would be processed and returned to Europe. The timeline was unclear, but the direction was definite. Prisoners would go home. But what did home mean anymore? Reports from occupied Germany painted devastating pictures: food shortages approaching starvation levels, destroyed infrastructure, families scattered, women significantly outnumbered surviving men. The economy had collapsed entirely. Disease was spreading, and everywhere, the occupation forces maintained strict control. The German women in Georgia received letters through the Red Cross describing conditions. Those whose families had been located wrote back with desperate descriptions of daily survival struggles. Finding enough food required hours of scavenging and bartering. Housing was scarce with so many buildings destroyed. Medical care was minimal. Winter had been brutal, and the next one promised to be worse. Irma finally received word about her family in late May. Her parents had survived, but their home in Dresden had been destroyed in the firebombing. They were living in a single room of a partially damaged building, sharing space with two other families. Her younger brother had been killed fighting on the Eastern Front. Her grandmother had died during the winter from cold and malnutrition. The letter from her mother tried to maintain positive tone, but the desperation showed through. "We survive," her mother wrote. "We are grateful to be alive. But life is very difficult. We pray you can come home soon. We need you." That need pulled at Irma powerfully. Her parents required help, required any support she could provide. Her duty as daughter demanded she return to assist them. However, possible, but simultaneously, another thought had been growing in her mind over recent months. What kind of life awaited her in occupied Germany? Even if she survived the immediate hardships, what future existed there? She would always be known as someone who had served the Reich. The shame would follow her forever. And, practically speaking, opportunities would be virtually non-existent for years. Meanwhile, her daily life in the Georgia compound had evolved into something unexpectedly stable. She worked as translator, earning respect from both prisoners and Americans. She had learned English fluently. The Henderson family had been visiting regularly, discussing possibility of sponsoring her immigration if such options became available. June 5, 1945. Colonel Hayes called a General Assembly for all German prisoners to announce official repatriation procedures. The 58 women gathered in the main dining hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle about what this moment would mean. Transportation would be arranged within weeks. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before release to return to their homes. The announcement created a stir of mixed reactions. Some women showed relief that their captivity was ending. Others displayed anxiety about facing unknown conditions in Germany. A few remained expressionless, too overwhelmed by competing emotions to show anything at all. Then, Irmgard Zimmermann stood slowly, her hands visibly shaking. She had discussed this moment with a small group of women for weeks, but actually speaking the words aloud felt terrifying. In clear, careful English, she addressed Colonel Hayes directly. "Colonel Hayes, may I speak for some of us?" Permission granted. Irma looked around at her fellow prisoners before continuing. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks. Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The words hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap. Several American guards exchanged confused glances. This was unprecedented. Prisoners of war did not refuse repatriation. The Geneva Convention provided for their return. Everyone assumed all prisoners wanted freedom and return to their homeland. Elfriede Becker stood next, followed by 9 other women. They formed a small group within the larger assembly, their decision clearly made. After long deliberation, Elfie spoke in halting English. "Colonel, we know what we are asking is unusual, but Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed in." Colonel Hayes was momentarily speechless. In his entire military career, he had never encountered prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. He asked for clarification, and what followed was an outpouring of emotion that revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone. Irma explained that they had written to the International Red Cross, trying to locate their families. Of the 11 women who wished to stay, only 3 had received any news from home. 2 had learned that their entire families were dead, killed in Allied bombing raids. The others faced complete uncertainty about whether anyone they loved had survived. More than that, they had found something in the American camp that they feared losing. "Here," Irma continued, "we have learned what it means to be treated with dignity, even as enemies. We have seen kindness where we expected cruelty. We have been given the chance to work, to contribute, to become better people than we were when we arrived." The implications of their request were staggering. Legally, they were still enemy prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention provided for their repatriation, not for extended residence in the United States. But their emotional appeal touched something deeper than legal procedures. Sergeant Patterson approached Colonel Hayes after the assembly. "Sir," he said quietly, "maybe I am speaking out of turn, but these women are not our enemies anymore. They are just people who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. Sending them back to nothing seems wrong." The 11 women who had requested to stay became isolated within the compound. The other 47 prisoners viewed their decision with reactions ranging from incomprehension to outright hostility. How could they choose to remain with the enemy rather than return home to help rebuild Germany? Did they have no sense of duty or national loyalty? Brunhilde Neumann, despite her own transformation over the months, struggled to understand their choice. She approached Irma in the barracks one evening, speaking in rapid German. "You would abandon Germany in its darkest hour? After everything our country has suffered, you would simply walk away?" Irma had wrestled with these same questions for weeks. "What Germany am I abandoning?" she replied quietly. "The Germany I thought I knew never existed. It was a lie built on propaganda and crimes beyond imagination. And the Germany that exists now is occupied territory, destroyed and starving. What can I offer there that would make any difference?" "But your family needs you," Hilda pressed. "Your mother wrote that they need your help." Irma felt that guilt like a physical weight. "Yes, my family needs me. And if I return, I will struggle alongside them to survive each day. We will scavenge for food and fight for shelter, and perhaps slowly rebuild some semblance of life over years or decades. But I will always carry the shame of having served the Reich. I will always be marked by that history. And here? You think Americans will forget you were their enemy?" "No," Irma admitted. "But here I have a chance to become something different, to prove through my actions that I am not defined by the worst of what my country did. The Hendersons have offered to sponsor me. They believe I can contribute to their community. That possibility feels like grace I do not deserve but desperately want to accept." Elfriede faced different pressures. Dr. Green had offered to help her continue medical training, potentially leading to nursing certification. The opportunity was extraordinary, especially for a former enemy prisoner. But she also felt profound duty toward Germany's wounded and suffering population, who needed medical care desperately. She confided her struggle to Dr. Green during a quiet moment in the clinic. "How can I choose my own advancement when my country needs healers so badly?" Dr. Green had considered this question himself. "You can heal people here," he said simply. "Suffering is not limited to Germany. And perhaps by becoming an excellent nurse in America, you can eventually return to Germany with better skills and knowledge to offer." That perspective helped Elfie frame her choice differently. Not abandonment, but preparation. Not selfishness, but longer-term service. She could become a better healer in America than she would ever have opportunity to become in devastated Germany. Annalisa Vogel had the simplest reason for wanting to stay. She had nothing and no one to return to. Her entire family was dead. Hamburg was destroyed. She had no job, no home, no connections remaining in Germany. The compound had become her only stability. The routine and structure had helped her begin healing from profound trauma. The women who chose repatriation were not wrong in their choice. They felt deep obligation to help rebuild their homeland despite the hardships. They believed that running away from Germany's shame would solve nothing. Someone had to stay and do the difficult work of creating a better Germany from the ruins of the old one. News of the German women's unprecedented request spread beyond the compound. Local newspapers picked up the story with headlines ranging from "Nazi prisoners refuse freedom" to "Captured women seek new life in America." The story resonated with Americans in complex ways, touching on themes of redemption, forgiveness, and what it meant to be American. The Henderson family had been visiting Irmgard for months through a church outreach program. Margaret Henderson, a librarian with degrees from Emory University, had recognized Irma's sharp intelligence and natural gift for languages. More importantly, she had witnessed Irma's genuine remorse about the revelations regarding her country's atrocities. When Mrs. Henderson learned of Irma's request to stay, she immediately contacted immigration authorities and military officials to understand what would be required to sponsor a former enemy prisoner. The process was unprecedented and legally complicated, but Mrs. Henderson was determined and resourceful. Her husband Robert, a lawyer in Atlanta, began researching relevant regulations. The Geneva Convention governed treatment and repatriation of prisoners of war, but said nothing about prisoners who voluntarily refused repatriation. Immigration law provided pathways for refugees and displaced persons, but those categories had never been applied to enemy prisoners who were technically still at war status when they made their request. The Henderson family discussed the decision extensively. They had 2 teenage children who had strong opinions about sponsoring a former Nazi. Their son Paul, 17, was vehemently opposed. "How can you bring an enemy into our home?" he argued. "She wore their uniform. She served their military." But their daughter Sarah, 15, had met Irma during family visits to the compound. She had been teaching Irma American slang and helping her understand popular music and youth culture. She advocated passionately for sponsorship. "She is not our enemy anymore. She is just a person who made mistakes and wants a chance to do better." Mrs. Henderson made her position clear to her children. "We are Christians," she said firmly. "Our faith teaches forgiveness and redemption. If we only show kindness to people who have never done wrong, we show nothing of value." Irmgard has demonstrated genuine transformation. She deserves an opportunity to prove herself. Similar conversations were happening in other families. Dr. Green discussed sponsoring Elfrida with his wife Catherine. A local businessman named Thomas Warren considered sponsoring Gertrude Richter, who had demonstrated remarkable skills in the camp kitchen. Washington's response arrived in late June after weeks of deliberation. The War Department had consulted with State Department officials, immigration authorities, and military legal advisors about this unprecedented situation. The conclusion was characteristically bureaucratic but unexpectedly flexible regarding the 11 German women who requested to remain in America. The decision stated that the War Department would not prevent immediate repatriation of any prisoner who wished to return. However, given unusual circumstances and ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. This new status would allow them to be processed for potential immigration, following established procedures for refugees. But the change in classification came with significant implications. As displaced persons rather than prisoners of war, the women would no longer be guaranteed housing and support at the military facility. They would need to find sponsors willing to provide housing, employment assistance, and financial support during their transition. They would need to demonstrate means of self-support. They would need to pass background investigations and medical examinations. They would need to prove they posed no security threat. The requirements were daunting. Several of the 11 women who had initially requested to stay reconsidered their decisions upon learning the details. Without guaranteed support, without clear paths to employment, without knowing if sponsors would actually materialize, the uncertainty felt overwhelming. Gertrude Richter, the youngest at 19, decided to return to Germany. Despite her love of the Wednesday moon pie rituals and her comfort with American life, she felt too young to face such uncertainty alone. At least in Germany, she might locate distant relatives who could provide some family connection. 2 other women made similar choices. The prospect of starting completely new lives without support networks or guaranteed security was simply too frightening. Better to face known hardships in Germany than unknown challenges in America. That left 8 women committed to staying despite the obstacles. Irmgard Zimmermann, Elfriede Becker, Brunhilde Neumann, who had surprised everyone by changing her position, Anneliese Vogel, and 4 others whose transformations had been equally profound, if less publicly visible. The process of finding sponsors proved easier than anyone expected for most of the women. The Henderson family formalized their sponsorship offer for Irma, providing legal guarantees of housing and financial support. Dr. Green arranged sponsorship for Elfie through the hospital where he worked, promising supervised medical training and employment. Local churches stepped forward for several other women. The Methodist congregation that had been conducting outreach at the compound sponsored 2 women. A Baptist church in a neighboring town sponsored another. The women's genuine remorse and obvious transformation had moved many Americans who saw their situation as opportunity to demonstrate Christian principles of forgiveness and redemption. But bureaucratic wheels turned slowly. Background investigations required months. Immigration paperwork involved endless forms and documentation. Medical examinations needed scheduling. Legal procedures demanded patience and persistence. Meanwhile, the 47 women who chose repatriation prepared for departure. The compound's atmosphere became strange and melancholy. Women who had lived together for months, who had supported each other through grief and revelation, now faced permanent separation. Those staying felt guilty about their choice. Those leaving felt abandoned by their companions' decisions. Irma spent hours writing letters for women returning to Germany, helping them communicate with Red Cross officials about family reunification. Elfie provided medical examinations and health documentation. They tried to support their departing companions even while preparing for their own uncertain futures. July 20th, 1945. The repatriation day arrived with oppressive summer heat. The 47 women who had chosen to return to Germany stood in formation outside the main barracks, their few possessions packed in small bags provided by the military. They wore the same simple gray dresses they had been issued months earlier, but the women themselves had changed dramatically from the frightened prisoners who first arrived. The scene bore little resemblance to typical prisoner transfers. Instead of tense formality between enemies, the atmosphere felt like a community gathering, bittersweet with impending separation. American guards who had worked with these women for months showed genuine emotion about their departure. Some had tears in their eyes. Colonel Hayes addressed the departing women with words he later described as among the most difficult of his military career. "You came here as our enemies," he told them through Irma's translation, "but you leave as something we never expected, as friends. I hope you will remember that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest times." Several women wept openly at his words. Months of kindness and unexpected humanity had transformed their understanding of what America represented. They carried letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the compound, and small gifts given by guards and staff. More importantly, they carried different understanding of former enemies. Irmgard stood to respond as unofficial spokesperson for the entire group, both those leaving and those staying. Her English had become fluent and confident. "Colonel Hayes, we came here believing we knew what America was. We learned we knew nothing. We thought Americans were our enemies. We discovered that the only real enemy was our own ignorance and hatred." The 8 women remaining watched their companions board transport vehicles that would take them to the port, then to ships bound for Europe. Tears flowed on both sides, but they were tears of hope rather than despair. Both groups were embarking on journeys toward unknown futures, but journeys they had chosen rather than simply endured. Sergeant Patterson handed out final moon pies and RC Cola to the departing women. The gesture made several women break down completely. These simple treats had come to symbolize so much more than food. They represented the moment when these women first encountered American generosity, when their expectations of cruelty met reality of kindness. Elfrida embraced women she had nursed through illnesses. Brunhilde, who had maintained rigid formality for so long, hugged companions with surprising tenderness. Annalisa, still fragile from her losses, clung to friends who had helped her survive her darkest moments. The transport trucks pulled away slowly, heading down the dirt road lined with Georgia pines. The women leaned out of the trucks, waving until the compound disappeared from view. Those remaining stood watching until the dust settled, feeling the weight of their choice settling heavily upon them. They were no longer prisoners. They were no longer quite German in the way they had been. They were not yet American. They existed in liminal space between identities, between countries, between the people they had been and the people they hoped to become. The next phase of their journey was beginning, and none of them knew where it would lead. August brought new challenges for the 8 women remaining at the compound. Their status as displaced persons rather than prisoners meant they needed to transition to civilian life as quickly as possible. The military facility could not house them indefinitely. Their sponsors worked urgently to arrange proper housing and employment. Irmgard moved into the Henderson home in late August. The family had prepared a small bedroom for her, simply furnished but clean and private. Her first night in a civilian home after months of barracks living felt surreal. She had her own space, her own bed, privacy she had not experienced since capture. The Henderson children's reactions reflected the complexity of bringing a former enemy into their home. Paul maintained cold distance, speaking to Irma only when absolutely necessary. Sarah embraced her presence enthusiastically, eager to continue their friendship. Mrs. Henderson treated Irma with warm professionalism, setting clear expectations while offering genuine support. Irma's first employment came through Mrs. Henderson's connections. The local library needed someone to catalog and organize their German language collection. The pay was modest but sufficient. More importantly, the work utilized her linguistic skills and placed her in an environment where she could continue improving her English while contributing meaningfully. Elfrida's transition proved equally challenging. Dr. Green arranged for her to work as nursing assistant at the county hospital while pursuing formal certification. The other nurses treated her with polite professionalism, tinged with suspicion. She was German. She had served the enemy. Some staff members refused to work with her directly, but Elfie's competence and compassion gradually won over skeptics. She worked longer hours than required, never complained about difficult assignments, and treated every patient with gentle care regardless of their attitudes toward her. Within months, several nurses who had initially avoided her became advocates, recognizing that her dedication to healing transcended her nationality. Brunhilde found work as bookkeeper for a textile manufacturing company. Her precise nature and administrative experience made her a valuable employee despite her accent and background. Annalisa secured position at a telephone switchboard operation, her technical skills from radio operation transferring effectively to this new technology. But integration into American life involved far more than employment. The women had to learn how to navigate American culture beyond the structured environment of the compound. Simple tasks like shopping in stores, using public transportation, understanding social customs required constant learning and frequent mistakes. Wednesday evenings became their unofficial gathering time. The 8 women met at various locations, rotating between their residences and accommodations. They spoke German together, sharing struggles and victories from their integration efforts. And someone always brought moon pies and RC Cola, maintaining the ritual that had symbolized their transformation. These Wednesday gatherings provided essential emotional support. The women faced daily reminders of their outsider status, shopkeepers who refused to serve them, neighbors who would not make eye contact, children who called them Nazis, veterans who glared with undisguised hatred. September 1970. 25 years had passed since that October afternoon when Irmgard Zimmermann first tasted a moon pie and RC Cola in a Georgia prisoner of war compound. She now sat in her comfortable Atlanta home, her children playing in the yard, a package of moon pies on the kitchen table beside her as she prepared to write letters to old friends scattered across 2 continents. Irma Mitchell, as she was now known, had become an American citizen in 1952. She had married James Mitchell, a school teacher she met through the Henderson family in 1954. They had 3 children who spoke English as their first language, but understood German from their mother's occasional use of her native tongue. She worked as translator for international business firms, her linguistic skills in high demand as global commerce expanded. Her journey from enemy prisoner to American citizen and mother had not been easy. The early years brought constant struggles with prejudice and suspicion. Some doors remained permanently closed because of her German background, but slowly, through consistent demonstration of character and commitment to her adopted country, she had built a life she never imagined possible during those dark days of captivity. The 8 women who had chosen to stay maintained correspondence across the decades. Elfriede became Dr. Elfriede Becker, earning her medical degree through night school while working full-time. She never married, dedicating her life to caring for others as ongoing act of atonement for her country's crimes. She worked at a clinic serving poor communities in rural Georgia, providing medical care to people who reminded her why she had chosen healing over hatred. Brunhilde married a veteran who had served in Europe, their unlikely union becoming symbol of reconciliation. Annalisa, despite her deep trauma, eventually found peace working with refugee resettlement programs, helping other displaced persons navigate the challenges she had faced. The 47 women who returned to Germany had written faithfully over the years. Their letters described the immense difficulties of rebuilding lives in occupied and divided Germany. But they also wrote about successes, about families reunited, about small victories in creating better society from the ruins of the old. Several had become leaders in German-American friendship organizations, working to strengthen bonds between former enemies. Irma's own parents had survived until the mid-1950s before passing away. She had sent money when possible, had written weekly letters, had maintained connection despite the distance. Her mother's final letter expressed pride in her daughter's choices and accomplishments, offering forgiveness for not returning home. That afternoon, Irma's youngest daughter, Emma, asked about the moon pies. "Why do we always have these, Mama? They are just snacks." Irma smiled and pulled Emma onto her lap. "These are not just snacks, Liebling. These remind me of the day I learned that enemies can become friends, that kindness is stronger than hatred, that people can choose to be better than their worst moments." She unwrapped a moon pie and broke it in half, sharing it with her daughter while explaining how these simple treats had represented everything America offered her: unexpected generosity, sweetness in bitter times, and the possibility of belonging.